I'm excited for this session because we typically in DAS, we talk about remediation broadly, but prioritization is such an important topic because if we think about how do we actually get vulnerabilities fixed, then in the most cases when we talk to customers, some of them are dealing with millions of different vulnerabilities. Sometimes they deal with thousands of different vulnerabilities, but it is almost always the case where it's a little higher scale than what they can process manually. And to do this, we have a lot of different capabilities in the solution, from being able to deduplicate data and contextualize this and understand this. We're able to advise what is the right way to fix them. But I think prioritization is such a crucial part because we have to somehow simplify the problem. We have to simplify the backlog. We need to explain to the business why we prefer to fix our vulnerabilities first. And that process has to be very transparent, very clear, both from a security perspective, but also when we work with the business on resolving those vulnerabilities. So when we started to think about the problem space, we figured that we could probably break it down to a couple different classes of methods that we're seeing that our customers are using to prioritize vulnerabilities. And this is what we're going to focus on today. But first, just trying to understand the breadth of the problem. I think that the vulnerability landscape and the exposure landscape in general is growing very rapidly. It's no surprise that the cybersecurity space has grown quite a bit in the last decade or two, but we're actually seeing this in data. So the number of published vulnerabilities here represented based on the CVE identifiers is just growing massively year over year, with about 30,000 vulnerabilities reported last year alone, right? So when we're thinking about how do we protect a certain environment, and we have different kinds of detection tools that can pick up those kinds of vulnerabilities, we have to account for the fact that in every given day, in every day that we wake up in the morning, there could be hundreds of new vulnerabilities that all of a sudden will be picked up by those detection tools. And we have to have a set process to be able to understand why we mobilize the business into fixing them, right? But it also means that that if we had manual processes to actually analyze these vulnerabilities, they will fail over time because of the scale. And keep in mind that CVEs are not the only factor to consider. We also need to think about misconfigurations, for example. We need to think about different classes of vulnerabilities that are not typically reported as a CVE, which results in a lot of load for a security analyst to actually make that judgment call on every single one. The other factor that is not really here is the growth of the infrastructure itself, the application environments, cloud environments. There's sort of an increase in their complexity, especially as organizations adopt DevOps practices. They adopt the cloud more heavily. They maybe migrate from one environment to another. It introduces additional complexity where there's sort of too many wheels that are moving at the same time, all of different directions, right? We scale up the number of workloads, we scale up the number of applications, we use more and more technologies, and at the same time, there's also a lot more reported vulnerabilities. And it's somehow, in some way, we need to contextualize all of that data and explain what is the highest priority, right? So I think this is not a new problem in the market. Since the beginning of vulnerability discoveries, people were trying to understand what is critical and what isn't. And there were a lot of different methods to do this. Here we're sharing the primary ones that we're seeing from customers today, but it is based on a lot of experience, right? Every company needs to deal with this to an extent. And I think that there's a couple different levels that we can dive into. The very first one is just based on the CVSS scoring system, just on the very basic vulnerability severity scoring that is typically attributed to every CVE. It's a pretty good scoring system. It's fairly rudimentary. The way it works is that basically we're looking at the vulnerability impact on that particular application or that particular workload, that particular component, for example, or analyzing what is the potential risk of that particular vulnerability as it pertains to the component or the code that it affects, right? It's good because it gives us somehow some level of standardization, right? Because we can actually break down those CVSS severity into categories like they're depicted here on the slide. We can understand what is the potential risk of that vulnerability. We can classify it in some kind of way. We can quantify this, but it still lacks a lot of information. I think that most of the industry has focused on this particular scoring system for quite a bit of time, and some customers are actually starting to evolve out of it to more advanced scoring systems. The first one that I want to talk about that is interesting touches not only on the impact of the vulnerability itself, but also on threat intel and the potential exploitability of this vulnerability. Now, any vulnerability can be exploited. It's more of a question of are there any in the wild attacks or attempts or POCs to actually exploit that vulnerability. Could be a good indicator to understand whether or not it's going to get picked up by attackers in the future. If what we're trying to do is to prevent incidents from happening in the future, then a good way to think about this is what is the likelihood of an exploit actually being used to target that particular vulnerability in the future. And this is basically the framework behind EPSS. So EPSS is the exploit prediction scoring system. It's a slightly different framework that we have seen some customers moving into. And here in this chart, we're seeing the comparison between CVSS version 3.1 to the respective EPSS score of the same vulnerability. And it's not surprising that some of the data here is not completely uniform in the sense that a CVSS 10 vulnerability is not necessarily going to be exploited in the future, and a CVSS 6 vulnerability does not mean that it is not being used by attackers, right? Because if in the first scoring system we think about the technical significance of that vulnerability, here we're actually talking about the entire market in the attacker ecosystem that may pick up that vulnerability. Now, EPSS in particular talks about the likelihood of an exploit appearing in the next 30 days. So basically, if it's 100% or a 1, then it means that an exploit is already out there. If it's let's say 80%, then maybe we're seeing some adversary activity around it. And in some cases, even if the vulnerability is high risk, we're not really seeing any pickup from attackers, and we don't believe that vulnerability can be exploited. That number is going to stay low. But the other thing to keep in mind is that unlike CVSS, that is assessed based on the vulnerability itself, EPSS has to be updated at any given point in time. So as we're seeing indications of compromises, as we're seeing attackers that are picking up maybe older vulnerabilities and starting to use them, that scoring system can actually be updated and affect the actual vulnerabilities that we've prioritized. That's one particular way that I'm happy to see a level of standardization there, and customers are starting to use this and adopt this much more broadly. But there's a lot of other ways to do this, right? Through threat intel feeds, through other open source data sources, through other kinds of assessments. But the important piece here to me is the fact that we're adding some additional information about what is the dynamics that attackers are actually using for those vulnerabilities, and not the vulnerability alone, right? Moving on to the third layer that I want to talk about, it's really now thinking internally on how our infrastructure is built and how the application is built. What is our exposure for that particular asset or application or component, and adding this into the mix. The reason that it's important is because we have a lot of information, we have a lot of data that we can actually utilize to prioritize or deprioritize certain vulnerabilities. let's say that there's a certain workload that is publicly facing, and there's a certain vulnerability that has a high CVSS score and a high EPSS score associated to this workload, and the workload itself is publicly facing. Maybe we want to be able to prioritize that vulnerability higher. But maybe there's a different vulnerability of similar scores and similar possibility of exploitation that is affecting another asset that we know is not publicly facing. It cannot be accessed, and maybe it doesn't even touch critical data. We would deprioritize that vulnerability for later, right? So we can't really think about vulnerabilities in silos. We need to think about this in the context of what we are protecting, and bring in additional information about the technology there, and additional information from compensating controls, from mitigations that we have, from the operating system, from the different components that are out there, really helps us build that formula to understand what kind of vulnerabilities should be fixed immediately, as opposed to vulnerabilities that can be postponed for a little later. But this is really coming from technical information. What I like about this is that we're still, for all of this, we can still use automations, right? It's more of a data question to be able to bring in all of those data sources together and be able to correlate them, and make the right judgment calls on every single vulnerability and prioritize them. This is part of what DAS does internally, but there's a lot of different ways that you can think about how to bring that information together. But now when we're thinking about the fourth level that we have here, now we're moving from the technical analysis of the vulnerability, the context, the attacker ecosystem. All of a sudden, we now need to deal with actual business priorities, which is really, really important, right? We need to understand if we have one application that's revenue generating, for example, and one that isn't, we need to be able to prioritize between the two. The more context that we have, the better. And I think this is something that drives the business in general, and sort of helps them understand how do we meet them where they are. We align with business priorities. We explain to them how does this vulnerability impacts their day-to-day, and we can actually make better decisions for the business when it comes to risk management. In some cases, it's fine to say, let's risk accept those certain vulnerabilities. We understand what is the potential impact on the business. We understand what is the potential if that vulnerability eventually gets exploited. But being able to actually funnel that information into the same formula, into the same logic, into the same scoring system for prioritization is really important, because then we have better ways to collaborate with the business. We can explain this to management in easier ways, and our prioritization scores are more fitted into how the business operates. Now, the last piece here, which I think is the newest one that we're seeing a lot of customers pick up, is based on root causes, right? So far, we only talked about the potential impact of a vulnerability. We can also think about what is the effort to be able to fix that vulnerability, especially at a large scale of millions of different vulnerabilities. You can think about different ways to normalize the data, to prioritize it, and then to take segments of that data and say, well, maybe one fix would fix multiple different vulnerabilities. Maybe one fix would fix a single vulnerability. How do we prioritize the two? So the trick here is to focus on the root causes for those vulnerabilities, right? Especially when we deal with larger scales, we need to think about what is the best action that we can take to be able to fix all of those vulnerabilities for good. With a technology like that, we can actually pivot that information, identify the root causes automatically, and then prioritize the actions that we're asking the business to take, not necessarily the impact of those vulnerabilities. What gives us is a much cleaner prioritization, but also a much cleaner backlog. So we can actually talk about, hey, here's the most impactful action that you need to take that will eventually fix a collection of vulnerabilities. Some of them are critical and have to be fixed right now, but you're also fixing some other vulnerabilities as well. If you're, let's say, upgrading a certain package or fixing a certain configuration. So this is really important because it also gives us sort of a friendlier way to explain to the business exactly what they need to do and why, and really aligning our priorities and our asks from the business in their own language, right? We're not only talking about CVEs and vulnerabilities and risk. We're also talking about, hey, here's actually how you fix those. So that's the fifth level that we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of different ways, a lot of different formulas, a lot of different decision criteria in different customers. DAS itself is heavily customizable, so you can actually define those scoring systems and criteria within the tool. But I would say the vast majority of them fall into those 5 different buckets. In the more, I would say in the grand scheme of things, the reason that we care so much about this level of prioritization is to build different programs, right? CTEM is one of them. It's a new term that is getting picked up. And basically it talks about how do we do continuous threat exposure management and not just vulnerability management. So it talks about being able to actually collect all of the data from all of those different tools, prioritize them consistently based on all of those different factors that we talked about, validate those that those vulnerabilities actually impact us, and then mobilize the organization into fixing them. The second one that is also emerging, and we have webinars on both if you're interested to learn a little more, is the ASPM market, the application security posture management market. Also another interesting market that touches on a lot of data sources that impact application environments in particular, and deals with how do we correlate, deduplicate that data, how do we prioritize it, and understand what is the most impactful vulnerabilities to our application, how do we identify the root causes, and eventually remediate them based on information that is coming from the CI/CD pipeline. So all of those capabilities, again, when we were thinking about this in that prioritization framework, are actually funneled into the same data set. All of that workflow is based on the same data set. It's really important when we're thinking about how to apply this at a larger scale. So just to give you an idea of how it works in actual environment, this is one of our customers in DAS. They're in the payments industry. They've built what they consider to be a unified vulnerability remediation program, combines some of the concepts from CTEM and ASPM, and they focused heavily on prioritizing vulnerabilities because they have to work with a lot of different business units. They have to create that level of autonomy for those business units. They have to explain to them exactly why they need to fix those vulnerabilities that they prioritize. And they have a combination of a very challenging environment. Application vulnerabilities, cloud vulnerabilities, on-prem vulnerabilities, being able to actually compare those apples and oranges and train the business to understand why we're prioritizing this. I think that the level of transparency that we can create through all of those different factors and the consistency that we can build actually helps them scale that vulnerability remediation program that they've built. So if you're interested to learn more on prioritization in general, remediation in general, on how DAS actually enables all of those capabilities, drop us a line. We have a lot of content on the website. We'd love to show you a demo of how it plays out. And thank you for joining today.